Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. Today's guest expert is Kris Oestergaard. Kris is a sought-after speaker, facilitator, researcher, and expert on innovation in legacy organizations, corporate cultures, and exponential organizations. He is co-founder and chief learning and innovation officer at SingularityU Nordic, a collaborative venture with Singularity University in Silicon Valley, which we've talked a lot about on this podcast, and great to have Kris on the show. His new book is Transforming Legacy Organizations, Turn Your Established Business into an Innovative Champion to Win the Future, all the way from Denmark. Welcome, Kris, to the Modern Leadership Podcast. How are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I got to talk to you about Singularity University because we have talked about it a lot on this podcast. Of course, I love all the stuff that Stephen Kotler and the group out there are doing. So tell me, how did you get involved and what's your kind of relationship with the Silicon Valley University?
Yeah, originally it dates all the way back to me reading a book by Ray Kurzweil called The Singularity is Near. And I have a background from market research. I have a background as an experienced designer, but I've always been a big reader and trying to expand my mind by also going into areas that I don't know a lot about. And I read this book by Ray, and I remember reading it and then thinking, if even 10% of what he's writing in this book is real, I have no idea what the world really looks like. So I got to figure that out. So I went to an education program at Singularity University in Silicon Valley, and it was really mind-blowing to me. And pretty quickly we started working with them. And myself and my co-founder, Laila Pavlak, we became faculty. And while running our own company with headquarters in Copenhagen, where we did, similar things to Singularity University. So when the opportunity arose, we jumped at bringing Singularity University to the Nordic. So we have a 70,000 square foot innovation campus in the heart of Copenhagen, where we have hundreds of entrepreneurs, where we have corporations who run innovation offices here, and where we run a lot of different education programs around the future of technology, ethical implications of it, how to innovate, stuff like that.
And what's the average length of like the course? If somebody was to come and go through the course, how long would they stay and be a part of this?
We run executive programs which are 3 day long, very intense. Dives into this stuff. We also run talent programs for rising stars in organizations that are much longer. They run over 5 modules over 7 or 8 months, where we meet up with them in total of 5 times. And then we do a lot of customized stuff that can have different lengths.
And you have most of your students or participants, they come from outside of Denmark and come in as like a destination. They come specifically to participate in your program?
Yeah, so we're based in the Nordics, and we have a lot of people coming in from the Nordics, but they really come from all over the world. We recently had people flying in from Hong Kong, even from the United States.
It's very interesting that you got interested in Singularity University through a book. I also did. Mine was through reading Bold and Abundance and Peter Diamandis and that kind of stuff. And so I've always been fascinated. And I agree with you that if even 10% of what they write about and talk about, and I assume, as you continue your writing and training and the things that you're doing, 10% of the stuff that you're talking about, if even that were true, the future is amazing, right? I mean, the things that we're going to be able to do, very cool. What's, before we jump into your book, is there anything that kind of stands out to you as kind of exciting about the future or something that's on the horizon that's really exciting?
I think there's so much, and that is really at the core of it, right? I mean, we are really living in times of accelerating change, and where technology is developing at an accelerating pace, which means that the potentials and the opportunities are only getting bigger. And that creates a lot of, issues for established companies, which is what I write about in my book. But it also, which is the other half, it also creates a lot of opportunity. So I think, the biggest game changers is within digital biology and the massive developments we're seeing in that space within technologies such as CRISPR-Cas9, for instance, that are going to revolutionize the way that we treat what used to be incurable diseases, cancers, et cetera, et cetera. That is a really big game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's jump into this book, Transforming Legacy Organizations. And you write about established companies and how they get into a routine and how they are really good at some of the planning and executing, but where they struggle is in innovation. And I want to kind of take this conversation in one direction, because I work in the legal field, the U.S. legal, lawyers, attorneys, that kind of field, which, while not an organization per se, is kind of an institution as a whole. And so I want to look at how some of these ideas, how you talk about, getting caught in the same routine and how we're good at planning and executing, but we're not super good at innovating, how that applies not just to legacy organizations, but, if you will, legacy industries. Does that sound like a fair?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's jump into it. So what was your idea behind writing this book? How did this spark, and kind of what's your general premise with it?
Yeah, so I've been working in the innovation space for many years. I've been working with startups, and I've also been working with established companies. And, in many ways, we live in the age of the entrepreneur, right? And we have all these entrepreneurial superheroes, the Elon Musks of the world. And we hear about these startups that become unicorns and disrupt not just companies, but entire industries. But really what struck me and sort of motivated me to write this book is that there's a lot to learn from startups. There are a lot of principles in what startups do that established companies can learn from. But innovation in larger established companies is entirely different than innovation in startups. And that is what I really wanted to double click on and inspect more closely.
Yeah, and I think it's so important because there is a lot of writing and a lot of attention that goes towards startups right now. There's a lot of energy and excitement. I lived in Silicon Valley for 6 years. There's a lot of energy around it. But the reality is a lot of us work for these companies that are either more established or in industries that are established. And so one of the things that you talk about is exploring 6 degrees of competition. And competition is something that every company is going to face. If they're not facing competition, then they're probably in a niche that's not worthy of growth. Maybe it hasn't been discovered yet. But let's talk about these 6 degrees of competition.
Yeah, so back to the notion that technology is developing at an accelerating pace, which means that the opportunities out there are increasing dramatically. The threats out there are increasing dramatically. We see convergence not just of industry, of technologies, but also of industries. And so the whole competitive landscape has become much more complicated than what it used to be. And that also means that you really need to broaden your horizon when you examine what is out there. And that is sort of the premise for playing this game that we call 6 degrees of competition, right? So if you take whatever core value offering that you have. So in the book, I use coffee just to keep it simple, right? So let's say, so what is 400 grams of ground coffee from Folgers, for instance? Let's take them just because they're a really big, well-known brand. It could have been any brand, right? Then you say, now what's like the first obvious degree of competition? What's the second? And all the way out to the 6th degree. And then something interesting starts to happen when you move further away from your existing core value offering. So running through it really quickly, first obvious degree of competition for 400 grams of ground coffee from Folgers you can buy in the supermarket is, name any other brand, right? You could literally come up with hundreds of them, right? They are practically identical products at the same price. What's the second degree of competition? Well, perhaps tea, right? I mean, if you drink and buy tea, you don't drink and buy coffee in that instance. It doesn't have the same amount of caffeine, but for many people, it also provides the same value of, invigorating or of focusing, right? Now, what's the third degree of competition? Well, perhaps Red Bull, right? So it's not hot, it's cold, but it's also loaded with caffeine, in many ways provides the same value. What might a fourth degree of competition be to the 400 grams of ground coffee from Folgers? Well, what about Starbucks, right? If you go to Starbucks and you buy a cup of coffee there, well, then you don't brew it at home. And typically, so I play this game when I do talks at conferences around the world with the audience. And what happens is that typically they're pretty good at following my drift on these number 1, 2, 3, and 4. But then once we go beyond 4, it becomes much more difficult, right? What's the fifth degree of competition to 400 grams of ground coffee? Well, what about the thing called the Muse? I don't know if you're familiar with the Muse. It's a meditation device.
Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So what it does is, right, so you put it on your forehead and behind your ears. And you also, when you use it, you also put on headphones, and there's an app, of course. And what it does is that the Muse reads your brain waves. So it can read whether your brain is in beta, alpha, or theta state, meaning how focused you are. Right? And the reason you have headphones on is because you can, on your app, you can choose different soundscapes. So the jungle or the city or the beach, and you hear noise and you hear wind. And the more focused you are, the closer to theta state you get, the less noise and the less wind you will hear. And if you're like really hitting the sweet spots, then you'll hear birds tweet. And you collect bird tweets on the app, right? So it's gamified meditation in a convenient way. And interestingly, it provides the same value that coffee does in a lot of instances, is that I'm drinking my coffee in order to focus in and zoning in on a task that I need to do, right? So that's a potential fifth degree of competition. Now, what could be a sixth degree of competition? It gets even more complicated, right? Well, what about autonomous vehicles? So why do I say autonomous vehicles? Well, think about it like this. What happens in a very near future when a lot of us, of course, depending on where we live in the world, but a lot of us will actually have the opportunity to take an autonomous vehicle to work? Will that mean that we will drink less coffee in the morning to be focused on driving? Perhaps, perhaps not, right? Maybe we'll just enjoy it more. But where do a lot of coffee brands, also Starbucks, even also Red Bull, where do they sell somewhere between 20 and 40% of their products?
Between gas stations and their shops, right? On the commute. So
what happens when we no longer need gas stations? The whole value chain shifts dramatically. And the question here, of course, becomes, do we sit in our boardrooms, in our management teams, in our research and development departments, in our marketing departments, and discuss the potential fifth and sixth degree of competition? And in most cases, the answer is no, we do not. We sort of go to the third or fourth degree, and then we feel we have a really good understanding of what the competitive landscape looks like. But that means that we're missing out on a lot of threats, but also a lot of opportunity as to where we could be moving our business into the future.
Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating. It's very difficult to keep up with the conversation that you're having and try to come up with questions to move this conversation along, because you've got me right now stunned with my jaw dropped, thinking to myself, every industry has these fifth and sixth degrees of competition, and the world is moving so fast that maybe 100 years ago, you didn't need to worry about fifth and sixth degree, because by the time that it actually came about, your career is done. But the industries and the technology is changing so quickly now that what before would have taken 40 or 50 years to materialize can now happen in 6 to 12 to 18 months. And so now we need to, more than ever before, start to focus on those further out degrees. Am I following you correctly?
Absolutely, right, and that means that, which is back to the core of my thesis here for the book, is innovation in larger established companies is much harder than it is in startups, because the systems are much more complex, right? They have multiple offerings, products, services, etc., which means that they need to innovate in multiple tracks at the same time, exactly to be able to prepare for the future and even to invent the future.
Yeah, and as we think back to some of these companies that no longer exist, that we talk about the case studies in graduate school of, Kodak and Blockbuster, these are companies that should have been doing this 6 degrees of competition idea in their boardrooms and seen that the world was going to shift and that they could get out ahead of it. They had the opportunity. These are established companies that had the resources, they had the intelligence, they had the staff to make these changes ahead of time. But because they didn't play this game, if you will, or go through this exercise, they missed it. And my first question to you then, Kris, on this is, as we go further out in the degrees of competition, it seems almost like tributaries of a river or something, where it kind of splits so many times. Or you're walking down a trail, and at first it's a fork in the road, and then it's 3 forks, and then it's 9 forks, and the exponential as we go out rings in the 6 degrees. It seems almost like there is too many variables, too many possible outcomes to be able to really come up with a unified strategy. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's massively complex. And that, of course, is an issue. And that is why design is so important. How do you design for innovation? And that is why I talk about that you need to innovate in 3 tracks simultaneously. And so track number 1 is what I call optimizing innovations. That's the metaphorical extra blade on the razor. If you're an established, successful company, you are world champion at this, right? So this is, when the razor manufacturer markets that now the razor not only has 3 blades, it has 4 blades. And then a year and a half later, it not only has 4 blades, it has 5 blades, right? I mean, so in many ways, this is good and right. You should be doing that. You should continuously look to optimizing the existing. How can we squeeze even more value into this offering, right? The problem, of course, is that what you're really doing is improving upon the past. You also need to prepare for the future. And that is what you do in the next track, which is what I call augmenting innovation, because this is where you upgrade the core of your existing business. This is where we see companies going from analog to digital, or where you saw companies saying we need to become mobile first, or where we now see all the biggest and the tech giants of the world saying we need to become AI first, right? This is a continuous journey. There will always be new technologies that we need to leverage to become even more efficient and effective, and to create even more customer value around our core offerings. So it's not really about shifting dramatically away from the core value that we're providing, but it's doing it much smarter and squeezing even more value into it by leveraging technology. And then finally, you have the third track, which is the mutating innovations, which is where you challenge the core. So this is where you do the what ifs, where you conduct your much more radical experiments. And that is very different from augmenting the core, where you are looking how to upgrade the existing, because challenging the existing, you cannot do that inside the old core. You cannot go inside a company and say, guys, you need to disrupt yourselves, even though I know it's popular, because that is like literally asking your employees to saw off the branch that they're sitting on. Who in their right minds would do that, right? What you need to do is plant new trees while simultaneously strengthening the old core. And that also means physically moving those radical experiments away from the core, because it's very different. It's very noisy. It demands new capabilities, new technologies, probably new business models, etc. So it's so different. It's much easier and more safe for you to try and build that up from scratch. And that is how companies, they need to think about increasingly how to go about their innovation. And that also means that it's different people doing different things here. Not everyone has the profile to conduct radical experiments. In fact, it's few of us that do that. But every single one of us should be comfortable with living in this world of continuous change, which we in general are not, because established companies have what you could call a status quo culture. They would rather, remain in the existing spot that they are, where it's nice and comfortable. But every single one of us needs to be an incremental innovator, which I define as people who are comfortable with change within certain boundaries. There's still boundaries and safety nets, if you like, inside the established company. And that means that we need to work a lot with our cultures. And probably really culture is the hard problem, if you like, when it comes to all of this digital transformation. It's much more about creating the right culture than it actually is about technology.
Yeah, and I want to get into culture just a little bit, because I want to turn to the book. But before I do, I want to ask you a little bit about this idea that it seems that, especially in the startup world, that companies are trying to be more specialized. They're trying to niche down. They're trying to, you've heard these quotes, these ideas, these mantras, the riches are in the niches. And as a small business, you should focus on your core business and move forward. And then we talk about large companies that have, or established companies that have board of directors, or they have investors, they have shareholders, and they're kind of constrained a little bit by that. And so as we talk about that, how do we reconcile this idea that, in order to grow and get a competitive advantage, to be nimble, you need to specialize, you need to niche. But if you want to innovate, you need to have some portion of your resources or some portion of your team working on something that's maybe not necessary. This is the planting of the new trees idea. Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, and that is what complicates the matter, and that is why the established company needs to think about how they innovate in these multiple tracks, right? So they have different people with different focuses on different types of innovation. One of the problems with innovation is that it's a very thick word. It can mean whatever you choose for it to mean. And typically we use it a lot, but typically people use it very vaguely, not really knowing what they mean. Just as they do with a word like disruption. What do we really mean by disruption? Nobody really knows, right? And so therefore it is key to be really precise on what you mean with the words that you're using and the design that you have for these innovation processes. And CEOs and top managers, they really need to double down on the notion that doing radical experiments that may ultimately mutate the core of who they are today is something very different from leveraging technology to augment the existing core. And it demands different strategies and has different design principles.
Yeah, we're dealing with people here, right? People, imperfect people with biases, people with roadblocks and challenges, mental mindset challenges that they need to overcome. And so this book deals with a lot of how to go about doing what we've been talking about. And of course, we can't cover it all in the podcast. We want to encourage the listeners to go and grab a copy of the book. But while we do have a couple of minutes left, I want to turn to one idea in the book. And you've got it broken out in a number of different parts. But one of the chapters in the book, chapter 6 specifically, talks about the individual immune system. And basically, this is the idea that employees don't want to. So tell me a little bit about this challenge, this individual immune system is written in the book.
Yeah, so having worked in Silicon Valley for a number of years, I've come across the notion of immune system many, many times. And typically when Silicon Valley talks about immune system, what they mean is large established companies that cannot innovate and the barriers for innovation. And what struck me in researching for this book is that, really how much finger pointing there's going on. Because the way that immune system is understood is, it's top managers pointing to middle managers saying they don't want to innovate. And the middle managers, they point to the employees, they don't want to innovate. And the employees, they point back to middle management, right? So everybody's pointing fingers at everybody. And of course, there's human resistance to change. It's a real thing. Right? It is partly constructed of our personality profiles, of our psychological biases, also of our capability deficits. I mean, there's a huge problem with capability deficits in most companies. But what I also uncovered in doing research for this really is that you have to think about the immune system as layered. There is an individual immune system, but there's also an organizational immune system, and there's also a societal immune system. And what I also uncovered is that the organizational immune system is far more important than the individual immune system. The organizational immune system, that is constructed of your key performance indicators and reward systems. What are we actually rewarding in our companies? It's about what you pointed to in the very beginning, our legacy IT, legacy structures, legal inside organizations. It is about our investors and shareholders and how they often have demands on really quick returns. And if you take the organizational immune system and you hold it up against the individual immune system, the system against the individual, then the system will always win. It is much more powerful. As an employee, it's not a democracy, right? So you can either sort of accept your fate or you can go somewhere else. You very rarely see people changing their companies if there's something wrong with the system. So if you as a top manager want to really transform and ensure that you move from a legacy company into a truly innovative company, then you need to change the system. It's much more important for you to change your system than it is to change your people. People are remarkably adaptable to change if they have the right context to do it within.
This is such a great topic. And as you kind of walk through, and that was part 2 of your book, where you walk through kind of the individual immune system, and then you talk about the organization, and then you talk about societal. Those are the chapters in that section. And it's so important that our listeners, that those who are leading companies, and whether they're large companies or small companies, innovation is so vitally important. And this is such a great conversation. Kris, I enjoy it. Unfortunately, our time is running a little bit to the end. We need to switch gears, talk about learning from leaders. Are you ready to move to the second section of this podcast?
Let's do it.
All right, my friend. The first question for you is this. What are you reading today? What's on your Kindle or bedside table?
Yeah, so the book that I'm reading the most right now, I always have many books going at the same time, is a book called The Leftovers by Tom Perrotta. I saw the TV series first. It's an HBO series. There's 3 seasons of it. It's absolutely phenomenal, about a world where a certain percentage of the world's population dramatically all of a sudden disappears, and then how the rest of the world copes with that.
Yeah, do you find it more of an entertaining book, or do you actually find that it has business applicability and things within what you're doing?
Yeah, so I find it really interesting because it deals with the people who are remaining, and not so much about what happened, but how are people dealing with it. So it's about human psychology, and human psychology is at the core of everything that we do.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you on that. All right, our second question then is your leadership superpower.
I'm really good at asking questions.
And why is that important?
I feel there are too many answers and not enough questions out there. I have training as a qualitative researcher, so I've spent most of my adult life looking for the right questions to understand problems and potentials at a deep enough level to actually really uncover all the material in there. So I find tremendous power in great questions.
Yeah, this is such a key leadership principle. As we talk about innovation, as we talk about 6 degrees of competition and really looking out for what else is out there, what's the next horizon, we really got to ask questions, because that's the only way we're going to discover new answers. We don't have them already. So I love that superpower. Our next question then is a motivational philosophy, quote, or mantra, something that you live by.
Yeah, so my favorite quote, I also use it in the book, is from Douglas Adams, who's the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he said a lot of great things, but one of them he said is that everything that is in the world when you are born is natural to you. Anything that is invented between when you are 15 and 35 is interesting. And everything that is invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things. And I really love that quote. I find it funny, but also really to the point. And I use it to remind myself, even though I work in this space, that I work to keep an open mind.
Yeah, and I'm over 35, so you know what area I'm at in the Hitchhiker's Guide, right?
Yeah, me too.
All right, our final question then is the book that you most often gift or refer to other people, your friends, family, and colleagues.
I have 2 books that in many ways changed my life. One of them is, as I mentioned, The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil. The other is The Experience Economy by B. Joseph Pine and James Gilmore, which was the book that led me to meeting my wife and my business partner and kickstarting my career as an entrepreneur and experience designer.
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating to sit down and have this conversation with you, Kris. You have a great mind, a brilliant mind that thinks through so many different things and is really challenging us to go to the next level with our innovation, to go to the next level as companies, and to think outside the proverbial box. Before we let you go today, tell us, how can we find out more about you, pick up a copy of this book, and then any parting piece of advice?
Yeah, so the book Transforming Legacy Organizations is available on Amazon. You can find me on our company website, that's sunordic.org, or you can find me on my personal website, which is krisoestergaard.com, although it's a little tricky to spell, actually.
Well, we're going to make it easy for him. We're going to put it on the show notes. All right, my friend. Well, thank you for spending this time with us today. We are better for it. You are truly an expert. Thank you for spending time with the Modern Leadership audience.
This has been a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, my friends, and a big thank you to Kris for coming on the show today, all the way from Denmark and Singularity University, Nordic. What a fascinating conversation. I love this idea as a business leader, as an owner, as a innovator. What are some of the things that we can do in our companies, in our industries to change for the future? I love this conversation of the 6 degrees of competition and really going beyond what we normally think of. I can't help but think if Blockbuster or if Kodak would have sat down as a leadership team and really walked through the 6 degrees of competition, that they would have seen on the horizon the changes that were coming. They were in the best place to make those changes, and yet they missed it because they were too focused on their current operations, on their current plan and executing their plan. Organizations are good at creating plans, strategic plans, right? We have meetings and retreats and day-long events, but we're not very good at innovating. And I think this is a great reminder for us to really focus on what else we can do, what else is out there. Of course, everything that we talked about on this episode of the podcast can be found on the show notes, jakeacarlson.com/ML138, episode 138. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And of course, remember, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.